I'm Norm Cummings, a member of the board of the Milford Historical Society and Museum, and I'm here today with Donald Tutson, a young man of 54 who grew up in New Milford, and he's offered to offer his thoughts on New Milford as it was growing up as a black young man and youth. And he was known as Chip. For those of you who view this, he was known as Chip when he was younger. So if you don't recognize the name Donald, it was his father's name and his name, but he was known as Chip as a young person. Donald was born in Danbury Hospital soon after his parents and sister Valerie moved to town in 1966. He was raised here and graduated as a standout student from Milford High in 1985. Noteworthy during his NMHS career was the fact he was a key member of a state championship cross-country team in the fall of 1984, almost 1964. His coach was the legendary Russ Devon, for those of you who remember way back when. Don earned his BS in political science from Syracuse University in 1989 with a minor in African American studies. So clearly Black American issues and thoughts on that were very much part of his life back then as well as now. During his college years, he started and helped run a small landscape construction company in New Milford, business I should probably say. And after graduation, he's been an attorney ever since. He had a 23-year tenure. He's had a 23-year tenure operating his own firm. Except for a few years in his early 40s when he moved back to town for business reasons and also family commitments. His family still owned the family home on Perry Drive. He's lived elsewhere, but he's always maintained his close ties with a lot of friends and his love of the town. So at age 54, I don't know how good your memories are about all this, but I'm guessing if they're awfully good
we'll give it a shot.
As an attorney, I'm sure they're probably excellent. Okay, we'll get started. What awareness did you have in your youth that being a black boy was different from the norm in New Milford?
Well, the first thing that you notice is that you're strikingly different whenever you walk in the room. So from the time I remember going to Peter Rabbit Nursery School when I was 3, that there's always kind of a visceral double take just on your appearance because you didn't look like everybody else. And that was really a continual theme throughout my life, even till today, especially when I'm walking into majority white environments. And the other thing is that people, this is maybe getting ahead, but when you walk in the room, people will always say to me when I had shorter hair, you know who you look like? You look like Obama. So I get that a lot. So the nature
of it. Bad thing.
Actually, it was helpful at times. But just the nature of the physical appearance, the difference is striking for people just who don't recognize that skin tone, the hair quality. It's just, you see people double take all the time, especially in the 60s, in the 70s when I was younger. You stand out literally like a sore thumb, so to speak. Yeah. And it was something I had to get used to. It wasn't something that was too troubling, but it was something that was there every single day in every context, walking around Milford.
A perspective that whites cannot relate to at all. I think it's fair to say. Even your good friends, just couldn't put themselves in your shoes. And I think that's striking. And it's interesting to hear that because there were when I was growing up, and even when you're growing up, and still there's not a high population of blacks in the communities.
Oh, sure. And even people of color. So even in New Milford, it wasn't like you had an Asian community or communities that otherwise were identified by physical distinction.
Right.
So my sister and I, and my father essentially could walk down the street and we'd be the only people that we'd see for days that had the same skin tone as we did.
And that's a perfect segue for anyone viewing this, listening in. What's important also for people to know is that you had a black father and a white mother, both of whom were well respected and very active in the community. I remember your dad well. He was on the Milford Board of Education was the first black person to serve on the Milford's board, and your mom was very active in church and as a social worker in many different avenues of town, and were well known, but it was very unusual to have a mixed marriage in the Milford. What impact on your life might it have been to have had a mixed marriage parents? Was that a factor at all in what you were talking about before? Or?
You know, that is, you know, it's almost normal now to see, you know, people bridging those gaps. But in the 60s, when my parents met and got married, it was unusual. It was out of the norm. It was frowned upon by the majority of the people in their lives in terms of their parents, in terms of all the social structures that would set eyes on that situation. It was just not good. So growing up as you know, as a child of that union, you know, there was kind of a responsibility, you feel, that you have to make people comfortable with the context of your family and your existence. And I certainly felt that, and you're going to probably talk to my sister about this as well, but she came first. So I think that she had probably even more of a distinct pressure on kind of softening the blow as, you know, see, the children will be fine, that sort of thing. People, back in the 60s and even probably till today, people say you don't want to cross, you know, mixed marriages across religions or races because what about the children? So that was that theme was something I was very aware of. And again, it was subtle glances, subtle aspects of where you are and as a family. We were distinct. We couldn't go anywhere without people knowing who we were. And it was strange. It was cute. It was nice. They were great people, but it was odd.
How much did your parents talk to you about that? It might have been only when you asked them questions, but did they counsel you? Or, I mean, parents, I know both your parents enough to know they were great people, but as parents, did they try to guide you or shepherd you through any of the...
You know, that's a great question because I hadn't thought of it as being, you know, counseled. My parents lived and set an example about the nature of their relationship, right? So I didn't have to necessarily hear the steps or the concerns because it was a part of our dialogue, it was part of our existence. They were very forgiving and very open to people who may have been insulting and unintentionally so. So I got a sense that they didn't have to sit us down or sit me down to counsel me about how to get through these things. They lived their lives together. They, you know, despite the challenges, they were very good at remaining a team. And maybe had the pressure more so because if they got divorced, if they fought, if there were internal issues, that would be another I told you so. So they were very instructive in their connection with each other and their connection with the community. So I learned those lessons.
That's fascinating, it really is. What perspectives can you share in your life as a black teen in Milford? I mean, I got to know you when you were a teen. I think I probably knew you around the church before then, but when you were a teen, you were active in sports, a real good athlete, but socially and in school, and I'm guessing that, and I know with your sister, the church was probably a nurturing environment and probably helped in some ways there. But what was it like to be a black teen in New Milford?
Well, you hit on a couple of different things. So the church we attended and were members I still am a member of the First Congregational Church here in Milford. That's where our family landed, so to speak, and found community even before I was born. So that place was very nurturing, and it allowed, I think, my parents space, and it allowed myself and my sister kind of a safe haven for the external New Milford stresses. So that was different. I felt like I could be myself a lot growing up as a child and going into my teens within the church context. It was definitely different as I got into my neighborhood and into the schools. I felt like I had to be oftentimes more aware of, the prejudices and kind of the people would impose things on me because I was black. I felt at times like that was the stress. Like, for instance, you're not as smart. You must be the best dancer. You've got to be the best athlete. Kind of the typical things that you get in terms of stereotypes were consistent. So outside, in the context of school, social structures with friends, those were continual micro battles, basically, that I was involved in. That were maybe different than any other young person or teenager as you're trying to get your hierarchy, your pecking order, especially as a boy. Where are you in the neighborhood when you go elbow to elbow, toe to toe with the rest of the boys, right? And
you happen to be a good athlete, so you were probably better than a high percentage of your fellow blacks or whites just because you were a good athlete. But I'm sure that was still a pressure on you.
Yeah, that was. I have to say, one of the things was, and I was a good athlete. I ironically, in that I am not as competitive as a lot of people in terms of going at it and going for it.
I remember Coach Devin saying that to me.
Yeah.
He used to analyze all you kids to me, and he did mention, he said, I wish Chip would work a little bit harder or whatever.
I don't think, and it's funny you say, because I don't think I was working harder. In terms of the athletics, for a long time, I could just beat kids my own age up until about 6th grade. 7th grade, it wasn't really that hard. Mm-hmm. So my initial context with sports was that in my peer group at school, I could pretty much beat kids my own age, and it wasn't a thing. However, I also, with that, going to the pecking order portion, and this is not necessarily about race at all. In the neighborhood we lived on when we first arrived in Milford, it was Canada Lake. I lived on Canada Lake Road North. And in the context of our neighborhood, I was one of the younger and smaller kids in the group of 10 or 12. So I used to get beat all the time, just by age and size. So as a younger person, I could pretty much be comfortable. I had to be comfortable with, losing, because the kid who was 4 years older than me is going to beat me all the time. And I think that transition probably to when Mr. Devin had to deal with me, because I'd be third, fourth guy.
He never had complaints about you other than the fact, Mr. Devin was a perfectionist with everybody.
Absolutely.
But I think what I'm getting from that was actually when you were then younger in your neighborhood, race was not a big issue when you were playing sports and things like that. It didn't seem like, you probably felt you were aware of it, but it was more just a matter of how good you were at something compared to the other kids.
Right, and that was the early message, again. And by the time I got a little older and moved to Perry Drive, there were a lot of boys and kids my age who were, we were at that pre-adolescent level, 5th grade, 6th grade, so it became a little more competitive. And that's when the other larger school activities opened up, and people my age became aware of stereotypes and all the other things that go along with our society, how it's stratified naturally. I don't think many kids, at least I didn't feel that there was animosity or prejudice or stereotypes that were positioned on me when I was younger, except for very few times, a number of times. And you didn't understand. Most of the kids that I dealt with didn't understand it. There was maybe 1 or 2 times when I was, say, before 5th grade, that we'd be running around the neighborhood on our bikes, and one of the kids, and you knew the family who it was. You just know the family. The kids are a mess. The parents are a mess. And those are the kids who are flashing the N-word. You get out of my yard, you do this. And that happened a bit. And one of the things with that when you're younger is, go back to my parents, my mother, who was white and kind and patient and a social worker trying to figure out contexts of people, And I could be making this up. My sister be able to verify it. And I don't know if I've even talked to her about it, but I remember when the first one of the N-word deal happened. I was maybe 6. And a kid down the street who was older had a mini bike that never worked. They always trying to start it, but one day he got it started and was running up and down the road, couldn't make more noise. And he was maybe 7 years older than me. I was 5, he was 12-ish. And he said to me, or at least I recall, "Get away, you're not riding this bike, you nigger." And I remember not knowing what that was. I just remember I wanted to ride a bike. And I was crying, and I went back to my mother and I told her what happened and what he said. And this is what I remember, and it could totally not be right, but this is what I remember. Her face going in a way I hadn't seen it before as a kid, and getting calm and talking to me about that word and how people shouldn't use it. And some people have different ideas, and it was a bad thing. And I do remember after that the relationship between my family and the family down the street where that kid lived was definitely strained and changed from that point on. So so meandering back into the
No,
kids'
that's all right. Let me ask you about socially, or in classes in high school. What was it like to be a black teen when you were 16 years old? And it's been ancient history for me, but hormones are raging, and you want to date, or you did date, and I don't know how often you socialized, taking a girl out to a dance or to movies or whatever. How is that for you in New Milford?
New Milford, it's stressful. I gotta say, because it was a numbers deal, right? If you look around the kids in my high school, junior high school, there are X amount of us who, you'd be interested in, right? So you just would have a crush on 3 or 4 girls at a time, or I would. And
good for you.
And in that selection process, I'd be competing with the other boys for that girl's attention, where I was funny, I was a nice kid, I could do, there was a hesitation there in confidence that I had from junior high school throughout high school. Even though a girl might like me better than the other guys, I still was not confident and comfortable in necessarily being together in public all the time, feeling the strain and stress of that kind of microscope.
With white girls.
Correct.
Were there black girls that you had on your list of crushes, or even the opportunity to go do something with anyone your age?
That's a great question as well for me, because again, numbers came. I think growing up consistently, there were maybe 4 black girls at a time, plus or minus my age group.
Yep.
And it just never worked out that I had crushes on them. And it could be, there's somewhere, I hung out with a lot of athletes who did X, Y, Z sports, or just, socially, there was just not times where I had a lot of interaction with the black girls in my peer group.
Right.
And there was the pressure that people would also, and maybe Val got this too, that if there was 2 black kids sitting at the table, we had to know everything about each other. And of course, if it was a girl, of course you 2 should be together. And I'm a little bit of a contrarian, so I would do almost the opposite. Because the nature of those prejudices were something that made me furious internally when they were put on, activities that had to do with the quality of who I was as an individual. So those are the prejudices that would, kind of compile their little bee stings.
So in other words, if there was a white girl that you wanted to go out with, you would ask her, regardless of the consequences?
I'm trying to remember the 5 or 6 years of those kind of.
Yeah, we don't need to go into details on specific dates or.
I would say that maybe I had a couple of girlfriends who were just, we just got along so well that it wasn't a thing. That there wasn't even a trying portion of it. There wasn't even a concept of that.
Right.
In the other, as you compete for those opportunities, though, it's harder. And I had girlfriends who were always from another school. So my serious girlfriends in high school were always from elsewhere, which meant during the course of my 5 days at school, I didn't have to, I wasn't worried about the other operations.
I think that's not unusual with athletes too, because you're exposed to, or you meet an awful lot of kids from other schools in your sports, as part of the sports, and you can be friends with them as easily as the ones in your own school. That's natural.
There you go. As a matter of fact, I think 3 of the girls that I dated kind of more consistently than not were from these sports I did. So I met them off campus and got to know them that way.
How might you mentioned your sister Valerie, who's, I shouldn't mention her age here, but she was ahead of you in school, let's put it that way. How might your experiences as a youth or a teen in Milford, before you went away to college, how might they have been different than your sisters because of the gender difference?
Right, so Val is a year, 16 months older than me. So as we started school here in Milford, she was 1 grade level ahead of me. And our experience in school probably could not be more different than, you would think, oh, just Tutson kids are, nice kids and they're only a year apart. Not so much. My sister, and this is how I remember it, up until I was 14, she was big. She was huge. She was bigger than me. She was stronger than me. And the context of where she was so far ahead of her peer group and me that I felt like she kind of had it, not say easy, but she did very well. She was smart. She was polite. People liked her. She was a focus of kind of groups in school academically. And she was big. So she ended up when I was
Big, you mean taller?
Taller, right? Taller.
Okay, we're going to qualify that
yes,
for her.
Yes.
Okay.
Not you'll see her. Folks will get to see her. She's an attractive, fit person, but she was tall and bigger as we were growing, as I recall. So she enjoyed, from my perspective, going to school, doing the schoolwork, competing with her peer group in academics, asserting leadership. I think she was class president or vice president at points, and really being involved in band and all the other social activities in that regard. And I think that her competitive spirit may have been fueled by some of the pressures that I felt as well. People weren't supposed to be, if you're Black, you weren't necessarily supposed to be smart or at the top of the class, right? My sister always did well. People knew that if my sister was in class, that she was probably going to do well because she's a smart kid. And she just was smart, but I think there might have been an underlying motivation, which kind of it compromised my educational experience because people knew that the Tutson kids were smart and Val was smart, so I kind of coasted and didn't do enough work academically. But I felt often the pressures of having to be articulate, having to be prepared, having to be smart to offset, especially in the 70s and 80s, the stereotypes of Black people and Black culture. That especially Milford was an isolated place. There were certain things that Black people did and looked like in terms of the perspective. And when you're in class as one of the few or the only, that's always with you.
So your experience then as an adolescent up through the end of high school was more grounded in your Blackness rather than following the footsteps of your sister, who was obviously a good role model, but she did different things than you did, and so the fact that you had a sister didn't really impact you negatively, other than the fact that she was a tough act to follow.
She was a different act to follow.
Yeah.
And again, I think she created a little space for me, right? Because she did so well. And I was inclined to maybe get in trouble, around with some guys who were fun, and we did some things that boys do, right? So my sister, my parents, by the time she left for college, I got the car going into my junior year, and you start back then in the mid-'80s, you got your license when you were 16. So for 2 years, I had the car, junior and senior year, and my parents were well conditioned to the child who has the car will be home at 10 o'clock because that's what Dad did. I did not so much. I used to get in trouble once in a while when my parents would finally wake up at midnight and realize I wasn't there, that if you don't get home next weekend by 12, you're going to get the car taken away. So I guess my point is that my sister and I were very different in that regard.
Have you thought about how living in New Milford, growing up in New Milford, might have been different for you than if you grew up in Danbury or Norwalk or New York City? I don't know if as an adult, you've thought back and said, okay, it was, even though there weren't many other blacks here, what advantages or disadvantages there might have been for you?
Oh, sure. You think of New Milford is its own space, even though it's 15 miles from Danbury. The demographics couldn't be more different. Absolutely different. Black people and people of color are so different than people from New Milford, in terms of white people from New Milford, right? So oftentimes people of color, especially when we were growing up, black people, they were used to being around other black people all the time, right? So that makes those groups were not distinct or special or worthy of looking at in terms of social structures, right? So I think my dad spent many years working in Danbury High School with predominantly black kids who were, in his office every day. And I think that potentially that one of the stresses on him would have been having to deal with his kids in his work environment, right? So I'm sure that he would have loved to have us been exposed to more black people, more black culture on a daily basis. And certainly as I went to college, he was very suggestive of submitting that application to his alma mater, which was Howard. And because I was a football fan and a sports fan, I didn't read those requests properly. I think he wanted both of us to go to historically black colleges, black college or university.
So you both went to great universities, but not black universities.
Right. I went to Syracuse, and that experience was a great experience for me culturally because that was the first time I had to sit around and deal with the compilation of other groups of people, especially black people, right? So it was that part of my life kind of was great because it opened my eyes to, hey, other people have to deal with this as well.
College years were transitioning into adulthood.
Yeah.
That helped you that way. Getting back to when you were in the Milford High School, were there things taught to you? I noticed when you were an African American Studies minor at Syracuse. When you were at New Milford High School, was there anything taught about Black history other than the peripheral issues of slavery, the cause of Civil War and like that, and the fact that in New Milford, the Underground Railroad probably wasn't as well known at that point, but it certainly was prominent in this area. Right. Were there any other things taught about Blacks in New Milford schools when you were a student? Okay, so my memory again on the history of what was taught is not going to be all that good. I can give you my perspective is that certainly there wasn't much, right? Just by the nature of the times. Late 70s, early 80s, the information was not part of the overall curriculum anywhere. So for it to have found its way here was rare. I do remember learning about the Ku Klux Klan in 5th grade, and this is I
Mrs. Bona in Pettibone, and she was a little tense talking about the issues of Reconstruction and slavery. And as kids, we didn't really, we were still trying to process it. And I just remember her struggling talking about the Ku Klux Klan and the violence and the nature of how Black people, by the nature of just being Black, were victimized by people who were terrorizing them. And she showed us a picture. I remember conflating it with, hang on, isn't that like the comic book people? And I may have even said that. And I just, in that context, the whole class was quiet, and everybody, whenever you're the one person with an afro in class at that age, and something comes up about slavery in that time, all the eyes kind of turn to you, like, you are that, you represent what? So the stress of kind of having to maybe be the focal point of those lessons may have actually, caused me to forget some of those things. So that's why there may have been more teaching than I thought, than I recall, but I do remember the feeling of being pinpointed and having it be an uncomfortable method for a white teacher talking to all my fellow white students about the horrors of this, when I would be the only one who would be subjected to that sort of deal.
When you were in that age range, and it might have been something you had over your dinner table back in the days when families had dinners together and everything, that how aware of you were, whether your dad or your mom talked to you about, since you probably didn't get much at all, if anything, in schools, about civil rights. And, for most people, they think of LBJ's civil rights passage of the bill in, the early 60s and all the different things that transitioned into the goods and the bads and the violence and the riots in different towns and cities and things like that in the late 60s. Were you aware when you were 12 years old, 16 years old of Medgar Evers, and Martin Luther King Jr. and John Lewis? Lewis probably wasn't as well known back then. He became so prominent in Congress after that. But were you aware of those figures and what they were trying to do, right, what they did accomplish?
Yeah. So, and I would say that you have to remember too that you're right. I became aware of the sociological stresses, the historical context. I would say probably when I was 7 or 8, and then like third grade-ish. So, it was literally the early 70s. And my parents had lived it and were living it, right? So the conversations about social justice, about economic justice, were all part of the daily life. I do remember that the nature of having someone be subject to violence, discrimination, because of the way they looked, like they had my hair, my skin. I just remember that injustice being so, I couldn't get my mind around it as a young kid. So I think I ignored a lot of it and just said, it must be over. And it was only, I was 8, so it had just happened. My parents had lived it and were still living it. And I do remember once, I think cable TV, no, maybe not cable. Maybe cable had just gotten onto Perry Drive. So I was probably 5th grade, and seeing for the first time the civil rights movement through the newsreels that were not that old, that were 10, 15 years old. So when I saw Black people walking the street peacefully, well-dressed, standing up for their rights to have access to the society like I had, like now my parents had, like my father had, things were moving forward, and I saw, and I think we were supposed to watch this as a family, and I remember pretending that I didn't want to watch it because I had something else to do, and watching it upstairs, and just being furious that this is what our country had done to people. And that in my lifetime, just about my lifetime, I just missed it. I was born 15 years earlier. That would have been me. My father had anything to do with that? Are you kidding me? How come people in my town who or in my family didn't stand up earlier. How is it possible? How do you do that to people? So I've been very indignant about the nature of the violence and the nature of how those legacies continue, because it didn't happen that long ago. The remnants are still going on now. If you look at issues with prisons and prison reform, issues with allocations of drug penalties and access to funds, poverty, all these things are the sorts of violence that are happening now. So growing up as a younger guy, I first noticed that definitely the early 70s was something that struck me as, and it's still, and again, with me to this day, which is one of the things as an attorney kind of orients me in terms of my perspectives on fairness, integrity, honesty, and justice.
Through the perspective you have now, and you've actually touched on this in a number of your different answers, you're very thoughtful, and a number of them have gone into this direction, but through the perspective you have now as a 50-something, how did growing up in Milford help or hinder your transition into adulthood? Your years of Syracuse, you mentioned what your years of Syracuse were an eye-opener in a lot of ways, but the fact that you grew up in Milford, as opposed to growing up someplace else. Our exhibit is the Black experience in Milford. So I'd kind of be interested to know, looking back 30 years to when you were in your teen years here, 40 years, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, that's a long time ago now.
Sure.
How did that help or hinder your transition into adulthood?
Well, it's difficult to say whether it's helped or hindered, right? Because you only get one crack at it, so
right.
You can't undo it. It is a unique experience. I don't think that even people today can really, have the context that I had and my sister had, because it was so new to be person of color in a majority environment, in an interracial couple. All those things were automatically supposed to be normal and equal and the same. So New Milford has given me a great deal of patience and a great deal of empathy for people of all races. It has allowed me to see that, generally speaking, when you're calm and you let people make mistakes, that you can see that people are repetitive in terms of who they are, from culture to culture, race to race. You will find the goodness in individuals. So I think New Milford has crafted me in particular, particularly to look at and understand the motivations of individuals. I don't think I would have had that context if I had grown up the light-skinned Black kid in the Black community, right? There would have been a different dynamic there. There certainly would have been a different, and that's another thing that most white people in white majority settings don't understand, is that, my parents had to make a hard decision on how we were going. They had to ask themselves that question, for my sister and myself. How are we going to orient our kids so that they can be, safe and complete, and where will that be? And where can we be safe in allowing them and feel complete, right? So they had to pick, and it could have been a coin toss, and it may have been the fact that my parents had great friends who lived in Milford and kind of brought them along. But it's hard to, the question is hard to answer whether New Milford was, a plus or minus good or bad experience. It just is what it is.
That's fair. And I think because you haven't lived here in a lot of years and New Milford has changed, the demographics haven't changed as far as racially too much. Probably there's more blacks, but there's also twice as many people almost as there were when you were a kid here. But the town has changed in a lot of different directions. The high percentage of people are commuters, or at least were until COVID. And whereas back when you were young, most of the people worked in this area, they worked in New Milford, Danbury, or whatever. But from what your experiences were, and the fact you've come back to town fairly frequently over the years, what advice would you give to a couple, a black couple who were 26, 28 years old, they've been married for a couple of years, they have a couple of little kids, they've been married for 5 years, have 2 little kids. Would you advise them, what advice would you give them about moving to New Milford?
Well, for any couple who is interested in just, I would say that it's kind of a repeat of what I just mentioned, is that you have to learn, if you are in a majority white or non-color, environment where there's not a lot of communities of color, you've just got to learn to be patient and learn to forgive people for slights that you perceive that may not be intended. Because if you can allow people to make that mistake racially, in terms of an offhand comment or a look or something that otherwise you might find offensive, and you will, because that's the nature of the game, is it if you forgive that person and get to the next step, which is see the individual, you'll be able to enjoy your stay. You will see that your kids are potentially safe, and you can always address those things. I would say also to people of color, especially black people, is that you can talk to your kids directly more so now about these issues. We're sitting here, and who would have thought that we had such a direct conversation? That's a great thing. So make use of the new environment to talk through these things, because you'll find that hostility is more about ignorance and trepidation and distance rather than kind of bad intent.
So in general, the young folks that you're speaking to, you'd have to kind of know at least somewhat, you'd have to know them pretty well to be able to make a judgment before you offer the advice, and they need to be able to look into themselves and say, am I equipped to handle this, and is this what we really want? And so there's variables all the way around personality.
Yeah, and be open to the fact that people are still uncomfortable dealing with people who don't look like them, especially if you were the one black or brown person in the room. So give a little latitude and know that most people are open to getting to know you as the individual that you are.
This is probably a dangerous question to ask you, because I know you're so thoughtful and you don't mind speaking your thoughts, but are there any other things that you want to mention or bring up that we didn't touch on about your experience related to New Milford?
I would say that New Milford made me, you wouldn't know it from this interview, but I'm actually a funny person. Right? New Milford made me funny.
I will vouch for that.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
No, I appreciate that. Because the perspective and the cast of characters that I got to know here in New Milford, outside of race, it's always baked in. So I feel like New Milford, the characters who allowed me to see who they are after we broke through other issues, whether it was who's the toughest, who's the smartest, all those things. New Milford allowed me to enjoy people individually, because I had to.
That you call them a cast of characters. I happen to know a lot of these people who are cast of characters, but I also know the way you're saying it in the context, it's a positive connotation. Cast of characters might not necessarily be a positive thing, but in this case, it definitely is. So what you're saying is that the advantages you had of being here and meeting the people you met kind of transcended some of the negatives that inevitably happened.
Yeah, and I will kind of add to that by letting you know that even though I went away and I had issues, with New Milford in the context of fitting in, if you look at my Rolodex or my cell phone and look through who my closest friends are, and the weddings I've been to, and the funerals I've been to, and the birthdays and graduations, 90% are friends and connections here from New Milford, and that's to this day. even though I don't live here anymore.
Well, that's a wonderful tribute to the town and also to you.
And to my friends
And work, yeah, for
you know,
sure.
my family, my extended family that I got by living here in Milford.
For sure. Well, Don, I want to thank you very much for the time. You're very thoughtful, and I know this is going to be a fascinating interview for people to hear, to view, and this will be part of our Black Experience in the Milford exhibit here at the museum. For those of you who are going to be seeing this, it will be hopefully on our website at some point. It'll be available. We hope to have the exhibits opening in November. And after that, it's available for anyone at any point. So look forward to hearing what Don says, and go back and listen to it again. He says a lot of really sensitive and smart things. So thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.